So I've made a list of 10 things that I think are important as an Elixir engineer when I'm using Neovim. Number 1, nvim lsp config, mason, and mason lsp config. That's a mouthful, but if you've done anything with Neovim, you're familiar with these. This is how most people go about interacting with the native LSP system in Neovim, and Mason in particular is what most people use to download language servers. Secondly, you're going to want some kind of autocomplete. I use a combination of Copilot via the copilot.lua plugin, and I use nvim-cmp a little bit. Next, you're going to want some kind of formatter. I personally use conform for this. And then you're going to want some kind of linting system. You can get by, depending on the language server, with just using native LSP for this. But I like to have an extra plugin to do this, and I'll show you why. So I use nvim.lint for this. Then for syntax highlighting Elixir, or syntax highlighting any language, you're probably going to want to use Treesitter, but you could use Vim Polyglot if you wanted. Next, you're going to want some kind of fuzzy finder. I personally use FCF, but Telescope is a great choice as well. Next, you're going to want some way to run your XUnit tests, and for this I use vim-test, but neotest is a great option too. Then you're going to want some kind of tab bar. At least for me, it's a necessity. I need to see my buffers at the top of my window. And you're also really going to want some kind of file manager. I personally use Ranger for this, and I have a specific plugin that I wrote myself for this. But if I got started today, I would probably use Oil, so I'm going to show you that. And finally, as an honorable mention, because I personally don't use it myself, is elixir-tools. This is a plugin that lets you use NextLS a little bit easier, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail, but it's kind of an alternative language server for Elixir. Quick note from Andrew from the future, if you would please consider hitting the subscribe button. I'm just getting started on my YouTube channel, and I would really love to hit 100 subscribers. That'd be fantastic. This is my first video on Neovim. I use Neovim myself, so I could talk about Neovim for hours, and maybe I will. But if you liked the video, if it was useful to you at all, I would really appreciate the subscription. You can always unsubscribe later if I disappoint you in some way. So if you're already a Neovim user, you can just add these plugins to your config. You probably have half these plugins already. If you're not a Neovim user yet and you want to try it out and you want to write Elixir, I would recommend going with this project here, kickstart.nvim. It's really easy to download. You can just clone it into your .config/nvim directory. You can back up your old one if you have any kind of config and just put this in its place and mess around with it. And you can always change it back later if you want. But I think this is the best starting point out there right now. You can see most everything is in this init.lua file. This is 99% of the config. And then there's two little example folders here. There's these two plugins that it kind of gives you as an example off the bat. And then there's a custom folder. And I've put some of the plugins that I talked about in the intro here, and we're going to talk about them. But before we do that, let's look at the init.lua file. So if you clone nvim kickstart, you're going to have something that looks a lot like this. You're going to have this big block that configures a bunch of plugins, and it does this with a plugin called Lazy. And you're going to have a bunch of these blocks that are config for various plugins. And a lot of the stuff that was in that 1 through 10 list is already here. We've already got LSP stuff. We don't need to touch that. We've already got autocomplete. We don't really need to touch that. As long as our language servers are running, the autocomplete from nvim-cmp will pick up Elixir function signatures just fine. So I'm going to jump around the list at random, but starting with the tabs. In Neovim, they're called buffers, but we want to be able to see what files we have open, basically. You can do that really easily, starting from the Kickstart, by just adding this Tabline table, and then within that, add line A as buffers and line Z as tabs. If I open a new file here, let's open the README in this directory. This is what the buffers look like. So up there in the upper left, you can see now we have README. and we can go back to init.lua and we can move between them. I'm moving between them with a key command that I will show you later on, but just know that this is what is going to display our buffer list for us. And then in the upper right, we have tabs. We only have one tab open right now, so it just says 1. Tabs in Neovim are a little bit of a weird thing, so if you're totally new to Neovim, just don't think about it right now. Now you're also going to have a section like this servers list here. I have added one line here that's just elixir ls with an empty table. You're going to want to do this, and the default nvim kickstart config is going to try to install, using Mason, all the servers in this servers block. So just by adding elixir ls here, when you restart Neovim the next time, it's going to install it right away. All we need to do is add that elixir ls line, and it will install elixir ls successfully. At least it does 99% of the time. And you'll have autocomplete. I'll show that off in a little bit. But the next thing you're going to need to do is set up syntax highlighting. If you're going to use Treesitter, Kickstart comes with a Treesitter config, so you can just come here and we can add these two items here. Your list is going to look like this. We're going to add elixir and EEX, and these are going to be the two Treesitter syntaxes for highlighting elixir. There's one final thing we need to do in this init.lua file, and it's coming down to around line 273. Your line number will be a little different. And uncommenting this line right here, this is going to load this file called custom plugins I'm going to show you in just a second. So that file is here in Lua custom plugins, and then go ahead and open this init.lua. And then here you can add additional plugins that you want. You can also add them in init.lua, but this is a convention of the Kickstart, so I'm going to follow it. The first thing I recommend you set up is some kind of testing. I like to be able to launch XUnit tests directly from Vim. I think it speeds up my workflow tremendously, and I use this plugin called Vim Test to do it. I have it configured just a little bit. I have this custom strategy, which is basically a way to force it to open tests in a new buffer. If you don't use this, it opens them in like a split window, which you may like. You can go ahead and do that. But if you want them to open in a new buffer, you can copy this. And then I have just a little bit of key bindings here. When you use lazy.nvim, which is the package manager, you can configure key bindings directly in these package management blocks, which is pretty nice. So I have 3 key bindings here. One to run the current file, one to run the nearest test, which will look at where your cursor is and run the nearest one, and one to run the last test. And I found that these 3 bindings do pretty much anything I ever need to do for running XUnit tests. Next, you're going to want some kind of file manager. As I said before, I use Ranger, but Oil is a really great option. I have one key binding here bound to hyphen to just open Oil. So if I hit hyphen, you can see there's only one thing in this directory, so we don't see anything else. But we can hit hyphen again, and now we're up to plugins. So we can hit it again, and now we see that custom and Kickstart are what's inside the Lua directory. So if we hit hyphen again, now we're up at the top of where we started with init.lua. So that's how you go up in this kind of method. You just hit hyphen to go up, and you hit enter on a directory to go down. It may seem kind of weird at first, and also if you want to reopen a file, you can just hit enter on that file. It may seem kind of strange at first, but really try it out. I think it's the best option today. If you prefer some kind of tree system, there's a plugin called nvim-tree or something like that. That's a pretty good option. I personally don't use tree navigation, but you might like it. Now we come to linting and formatting, which is probably the most difficult thing to set up. Language server stuff itself pretty much just works, but auto formatting is a difficult problem. It's not as simple as it looks. I use a plugin specifically for formatting. Now, depending on the language server you're using, some of them run formatters. Elixir's language server does run formatters, so you could get by with just that. However, when I'm working on Phoenix projects, Elixir is not the only thing I need to deal with. I need to write JavaScript or TypeScript. I'm writing HTML, I'm writing CSS. I need to be able to run other formatters that aren't just the Phoenix or the Elixir formatter. So I really recommend you try conform because it does make it really easy to set up these different formatters by file type. It doesn't install them for you. You still need to install them with Mason. So be aware of that. You are going to need to go to Mason and make sure that the formatters you want are installed or that they already exist on in your executable directory. This option is really important here, this LSP fallback option. This is what makes this whole system work with the native LSP formatting. If you have a language server like Elixir that defines its own formatter, it's going to run the Elixir LS formatter when this conform stuff runs. Same with Lua here. I think this is actually the language server, but basically the point of these blocks is that if these things are not found, it's going to check the LSP fallback option, and it is going to fall back to running the native formatter from the LSP. The nvim Kickstart repo does have this auto format plugin that you might have seen. You can use that instead, but I think conform is a lot better. Now, when it comes to linting, running Credo is pretty much the only thing you really need to set up that's any difficult at all. It's actually really easy to get started writing Elixir with Neovim. As long as you have Elixir LS, it all pretty much just works. The one exception to that is Credo. You need some way to run Credo, and there's basically two ways you can do it. One is you could use elixir-tools, which I will show off in a little bit, or you can run some other kind of linting plugin. There was one that was really popular for a long time called Ale. A lot of people do use that still, but I use this nvim-lint. It's really, really great. I love this plugin, and it works a lot like conform. You can define linters by file type, and I only have one set up here for Elixir, and it's going to work as long as Credo is on your file system. So that's all the plugin stuff. Kickstart gives you a lot out of the box. We only needed to add a couple things. But finally, in this init.lua file, back at the top of the directory, I have some keymap suggestions for you. You don't have to use these, but this is my suggestion to you. First off, have some way to switch buffers when you're looking at the tab bar. So if I open oil and I load another file, and then I open oil again and I load another file, I want to be able to quickly go to the left. So I have mapped that to Control H to go left, and Control H again and then go left again, or Control L to go right. And these are, of course, Vim specific bindings. H is always to the left and L is always to the right. So CL and CH to me make a lot of sense for going right and left between buffers. Next, this is a very minor tip. It's not super relevant to Elixir, and a lot of what I'm showing you isn't really, but GF, I recommend you remap G lowercase f to G uppercase f. It's just more useful if you go to a file name in a buffer that has a little like colon and then a line number after it. If you hit G capital F, it'll go to that line number. So I think it's a more useful default. Again, it's not Elixir specific stuff. This is just quality of life stuff, but I think you should try some of this out if you're getting started with Neovim. HL search, I think, is a must-have. It lets you, when you're searching, you're going to see these highlights. And then I map escape to do no highlight. That's what NOH is. And then run the escape key. So when I hit escape, it's going to clear out the highlights and it's going to act as though I hit escape anyway. Next, capital J and capital K. This is totally my opinion, but I use this all the time. I map these to do the up and down by paragraph motion. That is normally on these brackets, but I have remapped it a little bit more to do this big nonsense here, which, I'm not a Vim script expert, so I don't even know exactly how it works, but it lets you maintain the jump list. If you don't have something like this, then when you go up and down by paragraph, you're filling the jump list with new entries, and it makes it basically impossible to use the jump list. But if you map everything up like this, then you can just kind of hold J and K to go up and down. And that's how I navigate files in Neovim. A lot of people use plugins like Leap that let you jump around to specific lines and stuff like that. I'm a very basic Neovim user, I guess. I don't use anything like that. I like to just hold down the key and go, and that's just what I do. But because I remap J, you need some way to join lines, capital J, that is. I've remapped capital J, so you need some way to join lines, and you can just hit colon and do J, because that is a shortening of the join command, so you can do colon join. So that works, but sometimes you need to join a lot of lines, so I like to have G capital J to join a line. And then my final mapping here is kind of weird. I used to use Doom Emacs for a while. I'm one of those people that have jumped around between Emacs and Vim a lot. So I have muscle memory for closing a buffer with CX/CK. If you're an Emacs user, then that would be familiar to you. So I have BD for buffer delete bound to that. If you're not an Emacs user, this mapping is probably not going to be very useful for you. So I would probably pick something else, but suffice it to say, you should have some kind of mapping for deleting the current buffer. And then final thing that's totally opinion, I think scroll off 999 is so much nicer than not having the cursor centered all the time. When you do this, it just makes sure that there's always basically infinite space from the top and bottom, so the cursor always stays in the center of the screen. Finally, remember to come down here to this auto install thing in Treesitter, set that to true, so all these are going to get installed when you start Neovim the next time. All right, so I think that's about it for looking at the init.lua. Let's open up an Elixir file and test out how some of this works. So here we are in a project of mine. This is an RSS app that I've been working on for forever. So when you open a Elixir file or any file for the first time, you're going to see lazy open. You can open it yourself if you run the lazy command. This is going to open automatically when you run Neovim the first time after, and it's going to install all these plugins. You can then close the window with ZQ. You can also manually open the Mason menu by running the Mason command. After opening a file, it's going to have installed Elixir LS successfully. So make sure that this has installed. This is the key to doing most everything with developing Elixir. You're going to want to make sure that this installed correctly. If it didn't, go back to your init.lua and make sure that you have that line where it says Elixir LS and just have a blank table. But you can also install things manually here by going down to the specific entry, and I think you just hit enter on them and they install. So close this with ZQ. So now we're going to demonstrate first off that the language server is running. We know that it's installed, but we can also run lsp info, and you can see it says there's one client attached to this buffer, and it is the Elixir LS. So we can close this with ZQ, and we can test that it's running by, for example, let's change this variable to a variable that doesn't exist, and then wait for the diagnostics, and here they go. So we got one diagnostic telling us that this is an undefined variable, and we have another one saying that we're not using con. So that's the benefit, first off, of having Elixir LS running. You're going to get diagnostics. That is the key reason that you're going to want to run it. You also have access to autocomplete. So if we start a new line and we type put whatever, we're going to see a bunch of things that we can autocomplete. So if we keep typing, we're also going to see the signature of this function. And this all comes from the nvim CMP plugin, but there's also some stuff that's configuring the signature head, and it all comes from Kickstart. That's why Kickstart is the best way to start with Neovim, in my opinion. Now, this is easy to achieve. It's easy to get autocomplete and diagnostics working with Elixir. The Credo thing is more difficult, but I can show you that Credo works if you follow the directions that we went over. If you add a comment, fix me, whatever, Credo has a rule that looks for these. And we know that this is a Credo rule because if we come here and run mix Credo, it's going to tell us that, well, this is from Credo. So that's 90% of it right there. You need a way to run Credo. You need a way to get diagnostics. You need a way to get autocomplete. And you also need formatting. So if I do something that would be incorrect formatting, like I indent this one too many, and I hit save, you can see it formats it, and it's formatting it with the Elixir formatter from the language server. But of course, we set up conform, so if we wanted to, we could have different formatters going on and whatever. But for Elixir, all we need is the formatter from Elixir LS. But if we were running a JavaScript file in our Phoenix project, it'd be able to format those with custom formatters too. That's why I think this is the way to go. And as for test running, I opened a test here in this project. Let me show you that test nearest command. So if we hit leader, capital T, and then N, it's going to run a new buffer, and it's going to run that test. Or we can hit capital T, F, and it's going to run all the tests in this file. So that's why I really like Vim test. It's really easy to just come here to a specific test and just run that one test. Now, what about fuzzy finding? I kind of glossed over that. There's nothing Elixir specific about it, but Kickstart comes with Telescope out of the box. And if you're getting started, that's a great option. I use FCF myself, but Telescope is nice. So you can see there's some fuzzy search options here. If we hit leader slash, we're going to get fuzzy search within this buffer. Or we can hit leader to get fuzzy search of the current buffers. Or we can hit leader S for search and then F for files, and we can find a file in our project. And this is probably the thing you're going to be doing the most. I don't use Kickstart, and I don't even use Telescope for that matter. So of course I have different key bindings for this, but if you're getting started, Kickstart is a good way to experiment with using Telescope for fuzzy finding. So then we come to elixir-tools. I think it's a fantastic plugin. I just don't use it myself yet because I haven't been using NextLS myself. So basically the way it stands right now with language servers in Elixir, you've got Elixir LS, which is, I'm not sure if it's official. I think it is official, but I don't know if it's maintained by like the Elixir core team or not. But Elixir LS is like the main formatter option you have. And then this guy wrote this new language server called NextLS. And you can read through this yourself. It's got a whole bunch of different options. And he made this plugin called Elixir-tools. And it lets you run NextLS in addition to running Credo automatically. So if you did that, you wouldn't need nvim-lint. And it can also run Elixir LS, so you can run them both. And it's got some commands to run mix tasks, and Vim Projectionist is a whole different thing. And this is how you set it up here. It's real easy to set up. The only thing you need to do is if you have Elixir LS stuff in your LSP config, you need to then remove it from there and configure it here in your Elixir tools block. Or you can set this to enable false, and you can leave your LSP config alone, and you can still configure Elixir LS with your LSP config stuff and just enable NextLS here. Definitely give it a shot. I might set it up right after this video. I have no idea. If it turns out I love it, I'll make an update for you. That's pretty much it. That's how I write Elixir. I write Elixir every day. I don't have this exact config, but this is a great way to get started. Or maybe you're already using Neovim and you just want to see what a random Elixir engineer uses on a day-to-day basis. My setup includes all these plugins plus some other stuff, but if you're getting started, I thought you might find this interesting.